So it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, David Spicer, who is a licensed attorney providing the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, individual bishops, dioceses, organizational partners, government actors, and others with policy analysis and recommendations on migration-related issues and current affairs since 2020. In his present role, David leads the Policy Office of Migration and Refugee Services, engaging with all of the department's offices, as well as those throughout the USCCB to coordinate and establish collective needs, concerns, and policy positions, especially those of direct service programs. Previously, David clerked for the Honorable Elizabeth Tavetas of the Court of Appeals of Indiana and worked with the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Foreign Litigation at the U.S. Embassy, London. He earned his Juris Doctor from Notre Dame Law School and his Bachelor of Science from Purdue University. David is a member of the Indiana Bar and a former fellow of Notre Dame's program on church, state, and society. Please join me in welcoming David Spicer.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if this is going to be tall enough. I'll just hunch down, I guess. Good morning. I didn't expect to be in such a large room. I would much rather be at the tables with all of you. I feel bad speaking to you from the stage, but great to be with you. I took a class with Dr. Timothy Medavina at Notre Dame when I was in law school. At the time, he was chair of the theology department. I don't know if he still is, but that class was about Catholicism and the history of the United States. And at one point earlier on in the course, he said something along the lines of, American Catholics today stand on the shoulders of the women religious who came before them. And of course, the class itself very much validated that, and I could not agree more. So very honored and privileged to be here with you all and to speak about this important subject matter. I also had the privilege recently of having an early showing of a movie about Mother Cabrini, and it also, of course, very much validated that reality about the impact of women religious in this country, and of course, many others. But I hope it will end up in the theaters and not go straight to streaming, and all of you will have the opportunity to see it as well. So today, as you can see, as you know, we're talking about the federal anti-trafficking landscape. The title should actually be the federal legislative anti-trafficking landscape, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue as well. So it's mostly going to be limited to sort of the legislative side of things and what's going on in Congress, but hopefully it's still of interest. And of course, there's much that could be said about the administrative side of things as well. So we'll hop right into it. I had that very kind and gracious introduction, but I did just want to introduce myself again. I'm David Spicer. I serve as the Senior Policy Advisor for the Department of Migration and Refugee Services at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. What many people don't know about the department is we're the largest department at the USCCB. The USCCB has about 300 staff in Washington, D.C., and about 100 of them work in MRS. So, little known fact for most of the Catholics out in the pews, but something that we're very proud of within my department and at the USCCB as a whole. I've been with USCCB since 2020. I started in the midst of the pandemic, but I did have the benefit of doing a fellowship prior to that, and so I at least was blessed to know many of the people that I ended up coming to work with at that time. And I primarily work, full disclosure, on refugee resettlement. My portfolio has resettlement services. That programmatic offices, our two programmatic offices are resettlement services and children's services, and I have primary responsibility for the resettlement services office in addition to leading the Office of Policy and Advocacy. I have a colleague who has primary responsibility for the children's services portfolio. But in addition to that, I do work on sort of the anti-trafficking portfolio, alternatives to detention, comprehensive immigration reform, sort of the gambit of things that are of interest to the bishops and the church at large in the realm of immigration. So this is something that I'm very pleased to be talking with you all about. If we go on to our agenda for the presentation, I did just want to provide sort of an overview of the Committee on Migration of the Bishops and the work of MRS. I'm confident that most, if not all of you, are already familiar with the USCCB. If I could just get a show of hands of those who are either very familiar or fairly familiar with the USCCB and sort of, okay, wonderful. So just to sort of level set at the beginning in terms of what it is my department does and the committee of the bishops that I serve under does for the conference. Then we'll move into sort of the legislative discussion and the current landscape in Congress at the end of this current session. And then we'll move on to most everyone's favorite part of all of the presentations, which is advocacy and how individuals and organizations can be engaged in this work. Of course, many of you already are engaged in that work and in the advocacy especially, but just some other things to consider as part of that. So in terms of the overview of the conference, this is the outside of the conference for those of you who have not seen it, with our great statue of Christ there. The conference is sort of an interesting organization. Many people have opinions about the conference, and certainly the bishops themselves and individual bishops. But I'll just stick to sort of what I know best about the conference, which is my department and the committee that I serve under, the Committee on Migration. So the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Migration is responsible, as you can imagine from the name of the committee, for promoting the migration-related interests and positions of the bishops to public policymakers and others. This work is primarily done on a day-to-day basis by the Department of Migration and Refugee Services, so the staff that we have employed at the conference, including me, I should add. The things that we do are here reflected on the screen. Sort of generally speaking, refugee resettlement is a huge part of our work. And over the course of the refugee admissions program, about 3 million refugees have been resettled since 1980, since the formal program as we know it today was started. And about a third of those have been resettled through the Catholic network, through the USCCB, but working in close partnership with our Catholic Charities partners on the ground, who we absolutely could not do this work without, and of course their respective dioceses and parishes and whatnot. So this is very much a collaborative effort within our church, something that I think every Catholic in this country should be very proud of and should know about, certainly. Unaccompanied children, unaccompanied migrant children is another important part of our work. Again, that's something we do in partnership with the Catholic Charities agencies, and so that is providing transitional foster care and other temporary housing and shelter to unaccompanied migrant children who are taken into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement once they enter the United States. And so that's work that is facilitated by the USCCB as well. Of course, the reason we're all here today, anti-trafficking initiatives. And part of that work with unaccompanied children, a big emphasis of that is in fact anti-trafficking and sort of the trafficking dimensions of sort of the journeys of unaccompanied migrant children. So there's a very close connection there between those two areas. Another big part of our work is just the pastoral advocacy and education efforts, especially those relating to comprehensive immigration reform. This is something that the bishops have been beating the drum on for decades now, and I know many of you all have been beating that same drum along with us and so many other organizations, especially our interfaith partners. And so that's another big part of our work, and kind of folded into that comprehensive immigration reform is anti-trafficking and other areas that are more specific in nature. We have the Justice for Immigrants campaign, which I know many of you either participate in or are familiar with, and that's sort of the campaign that was created primarily for the purpose of advocating for comprehensive immigration reform, but as I'll allude to later, it's sort of broadened a bit since then. And then we have specific programs for certain nationalities, most recently Afghans and Ukrainians, and those sort of come up as the needs arise. My notes are stuck together, sorry. So this is the current chairman of the Committee on Migration, Bishop Mario Dorsonville. Bishop Dorsonville serves as an auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Washington. It's not often that the chairman is located so close to the conference, so it's been a great blessing to have him. And his term is ending next month. So just after the U.S. Bishops' General Assembly ends next month, Bishop Chairman will be succeeded by Bishop Seitz of the Diocese of El Paso. He will take over as the new chairman of the Committee on Migration, and I will have the pleasure of working under him in that capacity. And then a new set of committee members and consultants will also join him on the committee. So the committee itself is comprised of bishops as the members, and then we have lay and religious consultants, including currently Sister Donna Markham, who's the president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA. So women religious are also represented on our committee, thanks be to God. And this is just a quote from the bishop's most recent statement for the 8th International Day of Prayer for Victims of Human Trafficking, which takes place every February in unity with the Holy See and our Holy Father. So that is that. I will not read it to you all, of course. But I should also say that these slides will be available for everyone, which is why some of them are a little bit on the wordier side, especially for those who are unable to join us. So, in terms of our specific anti-trafficking efforts, this is something that MRS has been involved with at varying levels over the past couple of decades, especially. Some of you might have worked with one of my former colleagues, Hillary Chester, who has actually gone off to the Department of Homeland Security to fight the good fight from inside the federal government. She was involved with a lot of our programmatic efforts over the past decade, as well as a lot of our educational and outreach efforts. Some of you might have met my colleague who's here, Felicitas. She just started with us, and we're grateful to have her. She will be kind of carrying the torch forward on a lot of those education and outreach initiatives. And then sort of the programmatic things we do at the level of the USCCB itself, to a lesser extent these days. Again, a lot of that is through Catholic Charities agencies across the country, but there's the potential for some of that in the future as well. As far as what the anti-trafficking efforts have consisted of, I mean, just a few examples are listed here. We have the Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services website, sort of an online repository of resources. Oh, I did not go to the next slide. Thank you for the heads up. Please do not hesitate to interrupt me or call me out if I'm doing something ridiculous. In addition to BRICS, as we call it, we also have the Coalition of Organizations and Ministries Promoting the Abolition of Slavery at Sea, or COMPAS. We love our acronyms. I tend to think that we come up with the acronym and then come up with the words after the fact to kind of justify the acronym, which is also how we got Shepherd, and that one does not make very much sense if you ask me, because there's a period in the middle, which is not usually how acronyms work, but so be it. It was before my time. And then we have done case management through the Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, or TVAP, through the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's something more programmatic in nature. The Shepherd program in particularly is geared toward dioceses, parishes, church-based institutions, schools, to help to build that sort of awareness that's needed for the identification of victims of trafficking and sort of ongoing trafficking within our communities. So just given Professor Price's presentation yesterday as just an example of something that the church is doing so as to address the issue of identification that's so prevalent. Justice for Immigrants, the campaign I mentioned earlier that many of you are already aware of, is sort of our coalition, our grassroots coalition, that also consists of a number of core members, we call them. So the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, Catholic Charities USA, Catholic Relief Services are all among those core members, and then we have individuals who participate as part of JFI, and many of those individuals are women religious, as well as clergy and then lay leaders within communities, and then also just Catholics who are interested but don't necessarily work on behalf of the church in a formal capacity. So lots of diversity and variety within the coalition. And I'm happy to say that a big interest of the coalition has always been trafficking and anti-trafficking efforts. So as the coalition has sort of broadened to include issues beyond comprehensive immigration reform, trafficking has certainly been one of those and continues to be and will continue to be, I assume, long into the foreseeable future. I did have a video here that I was just going to show you as an example. You can go onto our website. It's there under the anti-trafficking section. It's sort of dated anyway, so I think this is maybe divine providence as far as not being able to show it. But it's just a 2-minute clip to help to raise awareness about trafficking and give people some ideas about things that they can do to combat trafficking. There we go. Okay, so moving into the trafficking legislation portion of the presentation. This is by no means comprehensive or incredibly detailed. I also didn't want to preach to the choir, so to speak, because I know many of you are already well versed in the area of anti-trafficking legislation and efforts. So it's just sort of a high-level view and then also some focus on individual pieces of legislation that are relevant at this time. So over the course of, especially I'd say the past couple of decades, we've had some major advancements legislatively in anti-trafficking legislation and statutory efforts. The first and certainly the most well-known and prominent of those is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So we kicked off the new millennium and the new century with a really important and welcome piece of legislation. We've also had and we've had successors, I should say, so I'll touch more on this in a bit, but this bill or this law has to be reauthorized every so many years. And so we've had a number of successor pieces of legislation that have had very similar names and also now names that are a bit different from the original. We have the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act of 2014, which made some changes to some of the prosecutorial efforts related to trafficking, and so that's another example. The same actually is true for the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015. We've had trade legislation and international agreements that have been adopted and ratified by the Senate that have included anti-trafficking measures. And then we have annual federal appropriations. So every year we have the discretionary appropriations process. This is, for the most part, how the federal government is funded. And so funding for anti-trafficking initiatives and programs and services for survivors is inherent in that process of appropriations. So to start off with the biggie, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, or the TVPRA, depending on whether or not you're talking about the original or the subsequent reauthorizations. Again, it's enacted in 2000. It sort of standardized the federal law around trafficking. So previously, prior to the TVPA, it was really a patchwork of federal statutes. And most of them had to do with things like indentured servitude and slavery and prosecuting those, of course, egregious crimes, but not necessarily trafficking per se as we know it and as it's now defined. And so that's the big role, one of the big roles that the TVPA played, was creating that federal definition of trafficking, and that was sort of accomplished through the 3 Ps as they're known. So the protection component, the prevention component, and the prosecution component. The first of which, the protection component, really did a lot to create new legal pathways for those who had been subject to trafficking but were not citizens of the United States or lawful permanent residents. So it gave them the ability to apply for what's known as a T visa to remain in the United States as a permanent immigrant. And then the U visas are for victims of certain crimes, included among which could be the crime of trafficking. So it definitely helped in terms of those who are not citizens or residents of the United States. Prevention, of course, is another big area and had to do a lot with this aspect of education and outreach, not only domestically, but also abroad in terms of the foreign assistance programs that the State Department funds. And so we had the creation of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which sits in the State Department and does an annual report on trafficking that is very reputable and well-known and used across the world. And then finally, we have the prosecution aspect, again, adding new criminal provisions and increased penalties for specifically the crime of trafficking and related crimes. The federal appropriations bills are important, especially in our current political climate, because they're what we refer to as a must-pass measure. We have to have federal appropriations by the deadline, the expiration of the prior fiscal year's appropriations, or else we'll have a government shutdown, which for the most part people are eager to avoid. And so the appropriations process, again, ranges from migration-related things, and trafficking certainly among them, to the sort of funding of the military and the Department of Justice and sort of every element of the federal government. There are some things that are known as mandatory spending, like Social Security, so they're not necessarily incumbent in the appropriations process, but the so-called discretionary spending are the things that the administration, that the president requests money for. And so these are the things that Congress sometimes chooses to fund and sometimes chooses not to, or provide as much money as the administration would like. But nevertheless, that's how the system is set up. So in terms of the appropriations bills, there's actually 12 of them total. And we have a bill for Labor, Health, and Human Services, which includes the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We have the State Foreign Operations Bill, which includes, as you can imagine, the State Department. And so these are just some of the line items that we have as part of those 12 different bills. Each of these 4 line items are part of separate bills, but it also shows you that trafficking is not limited to any one department or agency. It's actually spread out across a number of different agencies. Everything from the Department of Justice to the Department of State, and the Department of Education also has some anti-trafficking funding and initiatives that it supports. So this is one of the issues that is really crosses dimensions within the federal government, and is something that every department really is encouraged to be responsive to. And again, just because of the political divisions of our current time and how we have a split Congress, it's not necessarily the case that we're going to get standalone pieces of legislation, even for those legislations that are, even for those bills, I should say, that have bipartisan support. It's not necessarily the case that they're going to get put forward for a vote. So the difference between those standalone bills and appropriations is we can pretty much guarantee at some point, even if there is a brief government shutdown, prior to that happening, we will get appropriations bills passed by Congress and sent to the president's desk. And so they do serve as an important opportunity to get things passed that we might not otherwise get passed, because in addition to the funding, you can also get bills attached to the appropriations, sort of, woven in there either discreetly, or everyone is very much aware that they're being moved along with those appropriations measures. And so that is something that we are able to achieve in a way that we otherwise might not be able to with these sort of larger funding bills. This is the current legislative landscape. So we're in the 117th Congress right now. That goes until January 3rd of 2023. Once that happens, once we get to the end of this Congress, the very next day, the 118th Congress kicks off. But anything that has been introduced in this Congress over the past 2 years that has not yet been passed by both chambers and sent to the president's desk, and the president has either signed or vetoed, will have to be reintroduced in the new Congress. So I'm sure you all have a number of things kind of in your mind that could be included in that. We've certainly had Congress passing a lot of things. I mean, most people probably wouldn't think so, just given what we see and sort of the contentious debates back and forth. But Congress has passed a number of things over the past few months, but there are still so many hundreds of things that have been introduced that haven't gotten considered, even in some of the committees of jurisdiction that are assigned to those bills that have been introduced. So we'll be talking about one of those in detail in just a moment. But as you can see, we have 68 calendar days from today until the last day of this Congress. Only 25 of those are currently scheduled as being legislative days. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but if I had 68 calendar days left and I was only working 25 of those days, people would probably be raising some eyebrows. But our members of Congress, of course, have to go back to their districts. For those in the House and then those in the Senate, go back to their respective states and talk to their constituents and have town halls and, of course, certainly run for re-election, as is the case for many of them over the next couple of weeks or a week or so. So that's why there's not necessarily as many legislative days as there are calendar days. These are the days that are scheduled right now. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that either the House or the Senate add on additional legislative days. Could be a Saturday, could be a Sunday. So there are days that could be added in addition to these currently. So one of the pieces of legislation that have been introduced during this Congress is the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act of 2022. You can see why it's just best to call it the TVPRA or by its bill number, HR 6552. This bill is one of those successor bills of the original TVPA from 2000. And I'll get into some of the things that it would do in a moment. I'll just say as a disclaimer, it does not do everything that we at the USCCB or many of the other organizations working on this or trafficking survivors themselves would like to see. We heard Professor Price yesterday also talk about the need for a national survey, a national study of trafficking that is not included in this bill. It is the case, though, that there are a number of great things included in this bill, and it would reauthorize those programs under the TVPA that expired September of 2021. So you might be thinking it's been over a year since those programs expired, but you haven't heard about all of those programs just coming to a halt. And that's because, again, as part of the very important appropriations process, there's still funding provided for those programs. So even if they aren't per se reauthorized, there's still funding to keep them going and keeping those initiatives going as part of those initiatives. So again, another important thing about appropriations, but the formal reauthorization is still sort of a technical, important step that needs to happen. The co-sponsors of this bill are Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey's 4th and Representative Karen Bass of California's 37th. I think there's something poetic about the fact that you have a Republican from New Jersey and then a Democrat from California, and they have been leading the charge on this in the House for many years now together. Representative Smith, I should say, is a devout Catholic himself and sees this as a pro-life issue. He thinks the issue of trafficking goes very much to the heart of our church's teaching on life and the inherent dignity of every person. So he's very vocal about that and talking about this bill and the bills that he sponsored prior to this. This bill, in its current form, I think it's been introduced twice this Congress actually, but it was introduced in its current form in February. The House then passed it on a vote of 401 to 20 in July. Only 20 of our Republican legislators voted in opposition to that bill. And it has been endorsed by many organizations, including our very own U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, the USCCB, Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services, many trafficking survivors, organizations, and coalitions, a couple of which are reflected here, and then many more that I've not listed. But all of this is just to say it has very, very strong support on both sides of the aisle and within sort of the advocacy community. And yet, the Senate has yet to take up the measure. It was referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee and a couple of other committees of jurisdiction. None of those committees have had hearings on this bill since it was sent to the Senate in July. So it sort of makes you think, if something with this much bipartisan support doesn't get taken up in the Senate, what on earth are they doing? That's a great question. I work in Washington, and I couldn't tell you what the reason is that this bill hasn't been put forth for a vote. As far as I know, Senator Schumer, as the majority leader in the Senate, has not provided any sort of reasoning for why that is. But in theory, if it were to be put forth by itself as a standalone bill, it would garner the votes needed to pass. There is one thing that could be complicating that I'll get to in just a second, and it's a Senate bill that was introduced, and sometimes there are some some ill feelings between the House and the Senate, and there might be some sort of territorialness going on here. But it's all kind of speculation, so we'll get into that fun stuff in just a moment. Going on to the substance of this bill, basically everything on this slide is something new that the bill does. The reauthorizations, again, are important, but so are the $1.1 billion worth of funding that are attached to those reauthorizations. It would reauthorize the TVPA this time around until fiscal year 2026, so that would be September 30th of 2026 at midnight specifically. It would also reauthorize the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking through fiscal year 2031, so even longer than those other TVPA programs. This is the council that's comprised entirely of survivors of trafficking. I'm also happy to say that as of last year, they are now being compensated for that work, which is great. And I know that a lot of those participating in this conference advocated for that, so we're glad to see that. It would authorize a new program for the Secretary of Health and Human Services to carry out, which would be the Human Trafficking Survivors Employment and Education Program. This is something that we've also been calling for and would provide services to those who have been trafficked so as to prevent their re-exploitation, things that help them with self-sufficiency, with employment, with education, a number of different things along those lines. The Department of Health and Human Services does currently have services for survivors of trafficking, but many of these have to do with sort of the mental health aspects and just sort of the initial transition from those instances of trafficking to being free from those conditions. So this would be something more long-term, kind of akin to what refugees are provided in terms of self-sufficiency and helping to acclimate to their new communities and their new situations and that sort of thing. So something that the Department of Health and Human Services is already very familiar with, but just geared specifically toward survivors of trafficking. We have additional grant programs geared toward ensuring school-aged children are protected from trafficking in linguistically accessible, culturally responsive, age-appropriate, and trauma-informed fashions. This is quoted directly from the bill, so great, language that we're all happy to see and certainly welcome. And then finally, one other noteworthy thing that the bill does, this is not an exhaustive list, I should note, but it does require the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which Professor Price also discussed a bit yesterday, to integrate or to encourage, I should say. It's always something like encourage. It's not necessarily as forceful as requiring that the organizations USAID works with to incorporate anti-trafficking measures, but to encourage integration of activities to counter human trafficking into all of the programs that USAID does oversee, which is a very, very large list of programs, and so that's still a win in our book. So in terms of where we are currently for appropriations for 2023, technically appropriations for the fiscal year needed to be provided by October 1st because the fiscal year that we're in right now, the federal fiscal year, is October 1st through September 30th of the next year. So we're already in fiscal year 2023. We do not have appropriations for fiscal year 2023, but Congress did enact what's known as a continuing resolution. So it extended funding levels at the fiscal year 2022 levels into where we are right now. So we're currently receiving, federal government I should say, I'm not receiving funding, but the federal government is currently receiving the same level of funding for all of the programs that it did in 2022 at this time, and that continuing resolution goes until December 16th. So it just gives the House and the Senate a little bit more time to get their acts together and to come to some sort of agreement. This negotiating is mostly done by the leadership from both parties in both the House and the Senate, and then the leadership of their respective appropriations committees. So we have an appropriations committee in the House and then in the Senate. Both of them have a chair and a ranking member. Right now, because the Democrats control both chambers, the chair of the respective committees is a Democrat, and then the ranking member of each of those committees is a Republican. And so it will be up to those 10 or so individuals to kind of come to an overall agreement, and then the details get hashed out sort of as things go along. So that's what they're doing right now. The president did release his budget in March of this year, which was actually delayed beyond what it is expected, to be as far as the release date. And part of that was because we were also delayed in getting appropriations for this fiscal year. So for 2022, Congress actually took until, I think it was March, of this calendar year to get appropriations. God willing, it won't be the case for 2023 appropriations. They'll, by December 16th, have come together and established an agreement and can pass appropriations bills that get sent to the president's desk. There's still the possibility that that doesn't happen, and so they have to extend this process into the 2023 calendar year, at which point we'll see. There is a possibility that we get a full year continuing resolution, and that basically keeps the funding levels as they are now from 2022 the same throughout fiscal year 2023. That's a situation that most people are eager to avoid, but it could just be sort of a victim of the political reality. I will note that Senator Leahy and Senator Shelby, the chair and ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, are both retiring this year, so their term ends January 3rd. And you don't necessarily want your legacy as the chair and ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee to be that you didn't get an appropriations bill across the finish line in your last term. So hopefully that will be some encouragement for getting something negotiated on a bipartisan basis. But all of this is an opportunity for passing HR 6552, which is the bill that we just talked about. It could be included as part of whatever gets passed between now and December 16th. It could be passed as part of any subsequent measures that need to be passed if there's not an agreement by December 16th. And so we could have between one and many other opportunities to attach this bill to get it passed as part of one of those must-pass measures. The question is whether or not that will happen. And then there's also the chance that we get the bill passed by itself. So if we can convince our legislators in the Senate and all of their infinite wisdom, and Senator Schumer as the leader and Senator McConnell as the minority leader, to put this to the floor of the Senate for a vote and to pass it, then we can get it sent to the president's desk, and we don't have to care about appropriations as far as this bill is concerned. We still have to care about appropriations for many, many other things, but at least for this bill. So that is basically appropriations and the bills that I wanted to talk about specifically. I have here just 3 other bills that have been introduced in the Senate specifically over the past year or so on a bipartisan basis. And some of these matchups of senators are not necessarily senators you'll see working together on a lot of things. So again, we are fortunate that the area of trafficking is something that we do have a lot of bipartisan consensus around. Nobody wants to be seen as kind of the party or the person who is in support of trafficking for very obvious reasons. So in the first case, we have a bill from Senators Cornyn of Texas and Klobuchar of Minnesota. We have Senators Grassley and Feinstein of Iowa and California, respectively, in the second bill. And then we have Senators Menendez, Risch, Kane, and Rubio for the last one. And the last one is sort of what I was alluding to earlier when I said there could be some sort of territorialness going on here. This bill, this international bill, focuses solely on trafficking abroad, outside of the United States. So the work of the State Department especially. This bill, for the most part, is included as part of the bill that was passed by the House, but not verbatim. So there are some differences there. So you have these 4 senators who introduced this bill in the Senate. and of course, because they introduced the bill, would likely want to see what they introduced passed. And then you have what the House sent over, Representatives Smith and Bass specifically, and it doesn't necessarily reflect exactly what they did in the Senate. So that could be part of the problem, is kind of hashing out the differences between the two and deciding if they're going to make amendments to what the House sent over. It could also be something completely unrelated to this. Again, speculation, but it's Congress. So it's a pretty good possibility that that's the case. So we are now going on to our third and final section of the presentation. Hopefully I'm good on time. We will have, oh yeah, totally unintentional, but glad that you're there. Very flattering, nonetheless. So we will now be talking about advocacy and some of the things that people can do on an individual basis or with your congregations or organizations. Again, many of the things that you're already doing, but perhaps some that you're not. So hopefully you will humor me during this section. I do want to start off with a quote from our Holy Father, Pope Francis, who has been very concerned about the issue of trafficking ever since he became Pope in 2013, I think it was. He, of course, coming from Argentina, sees this as something very close to home and something that he personally witnessed as an archbishop and as a priest in his archdiocese, and he has teamed up with Archbishop Stano and others to make this something that the Holy See is engaged on at the international level, but then also encouraging the Episcopal conferences and the church, the local church in countries across the world to ensure that they are working on. So this is just a quote from his address to the Santa Marta group, which of course is a group that works very much on the issue of trafficking in 2018. And the reason that I share that quote from Pope Francis is because the Vatican did release pastoral orientations on human trafficking. In 2019, it was the Vatican's Migrants and Refugees section, which we work with fairly closely at MRS. And it seeks to align the universal church, the church as a whole, against the issue of human trafficking, or against human trafficking, I should say. And it provides key recommendations that are fairly general in nature. So it's not meant to be something that is comprehensive or exhaustive, but it is something to help, as the name suggests, orient the church when it comes to this issue. And one of the things that are referenced in the orientations is advocacy and dialogue, and especially advocacy that involves survivors of human trafficking and dialoguing with those survivors and ensuring that they have a seat at the table. So that's one of the things that that advisory council does, and something that the church has supported. The orientations are available at this link here from the Migrants and Refugees section. So if you have not already, I would encourage you to take a look. It's not the longest read. It's not an encyclical, so it maybe take an hour or something, but good to have nonetheless. Again, this is sort of preaching to the choir, so I went back and forth about including this slide because I don't need to tell a room full of many women religious and others who are already involved in this work about kind of the importance of advocacy and using our voice as Catholics. But you can always give me feedback if there's anything you think should be added to this slide. And I will just say, as somebody personally who has come from the law and kind of a background where Catholic social teaching is not necessarily integrated, it was at Notre Dame, I'm happy to say, but not necessarily integrated into the work that many of my colleagues in the legal profession do. It is great to have the wealth of Catholic social teaching to really bolster a lot of these efforts, and I think just sharing that richness with the society, our society, and our political leaders is something that I think we're just very fortunate to be able to do, and I think makes a big difference when it comes to a lot of these issues. So again, that's my little soapbox for all of you who I don't even need to provide it to. But ways that you can act in support of especially HR 6552, but then anti-trafficking legislation broadly speaking. You can request a meeting or join a town hall with your representative or senators, especially during this run-up to the midterm. Many members of Congress who are running for re-election are already involved in these sorts of local town halls throughout their districts or states. And so you could join one of those, and if presented the opportunity, you could ask a very perhaps pointed question about trafficking or a specific bill like HR 6552. You can also request a meeting directly with the office, and you can do this through the local office, the in-district office for the House members, or the local state offices for those in the Senate. All of the contact information is available online, and you can also use this link, this second link here. These are all links, by the way. I know they look kind of weird, but they're short and sweet for your convenience. So the second one here for send a letter or place a call has all of the contact information available for each person's legislators. Once you type in your address for your residence, it'll all populate so that you have that handy. You can reach out, you can have a meeting with staff, you can have a meeting with a member potentially if they're available. I will say, as a staffer myself, for the bishops, the staff are not to be looked down upon or to be doubted or seen as not as influential when it comes to these things, because oftentimes it is the staff who are then going on to convince the member to do one thing or another, or frankly just writing the legislation and putting all of the tedious work into that. So not to speak poorly of the members or our bishops, God bless them, but it's just kind of a reality of how things work. So anyway, staff, do not discredit or discount the staff. When it comes to meetings. We do have a guide here on the Justice for Immigrants website that will help with virtual meetings especially. And so I would encourage you to take a look at that if this is kind of new to you, or to share it with those that you're working with. It's available in both English and Espanol. So great for those of us who are joining in those efforts and maybe don't speak English as their first or primary language. And then sending a letter or placing a call. It's something that you can do that doesn't require them to kind of schedule a time with you, and both are effective means. Social media, of course, is increasingly important and something that is looked at as a way to communicate with members of Congress, and so you could always tweet them as well and try to get their attention that way. And again, the contact information is there through the USCCB's Voter Voice account, our Action Center as we call it. And then the last thing on this slide is just writing a letter to the editor or op-ed. Again, local publications are oftentimes something that our members of Congress look to kind of take the temperature of their constituents. So these sorts of editorials are a way to do that and to see especially what people are most concerned with, because they took the time to put it into a newspaper or something. So that's a good opportunity for all of us. And because I know many of you are women religious, you are excellent writers and perfectly able to do these sorts of things. We will go on to the next slide here with just a few more things. Joining coalitions for collective advocacy. We are currently at the conference of the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, so I know you're already involved at least with this coalition. In addition to the U.S. Sisters, there are a number of others, both sort of within the church and outside of the church. Talitha Kum is the international network, which I know the U.S. Catholic Sisters are already a part of, but works closely with the Holy See and kind of the church on the global level. And then Justice for Immigrants, again, I'm just going to take every opportunity I can to do a little bit of advertising, and if you're not already involved, I would encourage you to be involved with our Justice for Immigrants Coalition. And then finally, just staying informed, which is something I think we all as concerned citizens are encouraged to do, and each of the agencies that have programs or initiatives related to trafficking have either a newsletter or some sort of communication that you can sign up for. And so for the Department of Homeland Security, it's the Blue Campaign, and this is really about prosecuting, for the most part, those who are engaged in trafficking. The DOJ is the Office of Victims of Crime, providing services to victims of crime, but then also talking about things like prevention and intervention. And then there's the Department of Health and Human Services, Office on Trafficking in Persons, which is within the Office of, or the Administration of Children and Families. And this is the direct service part of HHS that works with survivors of trafficking. So previously, the USCCB, for example, had programs funded through this office. And then finally, the Department of State, again, that annual Trafficking in Persons report that I mentioned is just a good read. You know, it's not, you might have to do it in kind of periods of time. I don't know if I would just, it's like Genesis, you can't just like sit and like read through the whole thing and not like be deterred. So anyway, just something also to take a look at. And then I am happy to present this QR code. We're all well aware that the church, in all its many great aspects, is not necessarily known as being on the forefront of technology, emerging technologies. But if you have a smartphone, I see a couple of eager participants over there, thank you. You can whip it out and go to your camera, and you can scan this QR code, or you can type in the link there at the bottom in green. And it will take you to the action alert for HR 6552, which is the trafficking reauthorization bill that is currently waiting for the Senate to act. And you can complete that, very easy, take just a minute or two, and send that message right now to your senators, urging them to work with their colleagues to take up that bill and pass it before the end of this Congress. So I encourage you to do that. Some of you already have because you're signed up for the Justice for Immigrants updates, and so you're well ahead of the game. So I'll give everyone who's interested just a second or two maybe to do that or copy it down. Again, the slides are available. There's also a little thing out there that you can scan, so no pressure. But also kind of a little bit of pressure, I guess. And again, this is endorsed by survivors of trafficking. So it's great to stand in solidarity with those who have experienced the scourge of trafficking in this way. So that's pretty much all for me. I'm, of course, more than happy to answer any questions. I don't know that I really want to stay up on this stage. Again, I feel so bad talking down to you all from this stage. But we do have another QR code. Again, I'm really pushing this QR code thing. And a link if you are interested in the Justice for Immigrants updates. It's a bi-weekly newsletter, so we're not spamming your inbox or anything too crazily. It does provide things related to kind of the full range of the work of migration and refugee services, but included, very much so, part of that are our anti-trafficking efforts. And so you all would have interest in that, certainly, but then I'm sure many of the other things that we work on as well. My office contributes to those, but it's also our Office of Education and Outreach that sort of oversees that publication. My email and the website for MRS and Justice for Immigrants are also there. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm also happy to provide you my phone number now, my cell phone number, if any of you are interested in getting in contact with me that way. I don't really have much of a life, so it's not like you're bothering me if you reach out or anything. Yeah, I just want to say to Katie and to the U.S. Catholic Sisters, thank you so much for having me. Really is a blessing to be here. I'm so grateful to see all of you in person, and then we can gather together. So anyway, questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Nancy Miller in the Dubuque Diocese of Iowa. First of all, I do want to thank you for the work that you do at this federal level, and cannot thank you enough for providing quality, as they say, quality programming, and really real live issues in legislation that we can do. Unfortunately, Grassley is in the state of Iowa, and he touts himself, I just say this is embarrassing, touts himself as one of the most bipartisan senators. He's 89 and up for re-election. It's embarrassing. all that aside is that I know what you do and understand legislation and all of that. But what I know, we have 4 bishops, archbishops in the state of Iowa, and have met with Tom Chapman, who is their lobbyist, good guy, and says that the bishops are very supportive of anti-trafficking. So we met with them as a coalition, and I personally just said, it would be great that the public knew that. So really call them in a gentle way that the bishops publicly would make a statement, as they have done on immigration, death penalty, and abortion. And that's not moved the needle. I'm offering that information to say, can you offer any insights on how to move that needle? And I'm a realist, but to say, it's nice that we can pat ourselves on the back, but publicly, people in the state of Iowa don't know that. So do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, you want the inside scoop, is that?
Well, no, you know what, I really, pragmatically, it would be great if they made a public statement, and they haven't. And if you have any real suggestions on how we can really just help that move forward,
Sure.
that would be helpful.
When you say, just a couple of clarifying questions, when you say they, do you mean the bishops in Iowa specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what because very rare at the national level, international, and do that, and I realize that's kind of a different realm than what you're in, but, we'd like to know how, how to move the needle, certainly in Washington, but in a small state like Iowa, and really how to get them to do this, and knowing that they're very diverse in terms of personalities. That's not so unique, as we know. But if you could give any tangible, pragmatic suggestions, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tom, I'm glad that you already met with him. That's a great first step, and that's who I would go to. Tom is the executive director of the Iowa Catholic Conference. And so for those of you who don't know, every state, for the most part, with a couple of minor exceptions, I shouldn't say minor, a couple of exceptions, don't have their own state conferences, which really serves kind of a similar role to the USCCB within the states and with their state legislatures and executive branches. So Tom, of course, oversees all of the efforts of the state conference on all of the issues that they work on. And so he would be my primary contact, in addition to the bishops and their staffs of each of the respective dioceses in Iowa. I will say, just kind of as a general manner, on immigration and a lot of these issues that I work on, the state conferences are not always the most versed in these issues. And there's a practical reason for that, which is that almost entirely they have been handled at the federal level, so by Congress or the executive branch or even the courts, the federal courts. And so the state conferences don't really have as much expertise or exposure to things like trafficking or immigration, although, as you point out, Sister, they certainly, I think, have probably released statements on immigration within the state of Iowa. Trafficking it's a unique one. So and again, I'm not trying to provide any sorts of justifications or excuses, just kind of the, sort of the reality of how responsibilities and focuses are divided. So Tom, again, is a great person. I personally am happy to speak with you after more about this and who you've talked to, and then because also Senator Grassley serves as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, he plays a very crucial role in everything that goes through that committee. So all of the bills that we have for dreamers and other undocumented persons, victims of trafficking, anything really within immigration for the most part goes through the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator Grassley is not the most accommodating when it comes to those issues. I think maybe dreamers are the one population that he has expressed some sympathy toward, but not necessarily as far as we would like him to. So I'm happy to speak with you, Sister Nancy, and we can talk about who, in addition to Tom, we can talk to. I can reach out next week once I get back to the office and approach the bishops of Iowa about doing a statement, an op-ed, or a letter related to trafficking, especially because of this legislation. So this is a good opportunity. This goes for all of you, I should say, not just the great state of Iowa, but wherever you are, especially if you have Republican senators, but also Democratic senators too. Happy to work with you to reach out to your state conferences or your individual diocese or your nearest archdiocese within the state to ask them to do some sort of effort to support this bill. I will be doing that anyway because we would really like to get HR 6552 over the finish line before January 3rd. So I'm going to be doing that, but the help that I have from all of you is always much appreciated. My office is small but mighty. It's currently just me and then one policy advisor, and then I'm working furiously to bring on a second policy advisor, and then we have some education and outreach folks. So when I say that MRS is the largest department at the conference, it's not my office that makes up most of that department. So please, sister, let's talk after, and we can hash out a plan. Yes, I am.
Thank you. Last evening it was mentioned that the United States does not have a national data collection for trafficking, and it was suggested that we lobby for that. What would be the best way to start doing that, and so that we could bring it back to the people that we represent and encourage them to do it also?
Absolutely, great question. I mentioned Representative Smith of New Jersey and then Representative Bass of California in the House have been the leads on the trafficking victim protection reauthorization bills in recent years. And so either of those offices are great to reach out to. Where are you from? California, perfect, awesome. So you may not be even a constituent of Representative Bass within her district, but just being from California, I know she'll be interested in hearing from you about that. You also have Senator Padilla, who has taken a pretty strong interest in these issues. And so I would also encourage you to reach out to Senator Padilla. Senator Feinstein, same thing. She has also taken an interest in these issues and was one of the co-sponsors, as you saw, of the international bill that was introduced in the Senate. So those are just some names that I would throw out there to you to reach out to with your friends and colleagues back in California, and to specifically ask them about this, because we are going to need to reauthorize the TVPA in X many years. I don't know if it's going to be 2026, depending on how this bill goes. It could be 2026, but even before then, we have these appropriations bills. And one of the things that we love to include in appropriations bills are these sorts of one-off, not necessarily one-off, but these sorts of information collection activities. So sometimes it's related to a study to find out whether or not a program is actually needed to be funded. And then sometimes it's something like this, like a survey. So I would go to those representatives and senators you have in California. I would tell them specifically, this is something that's needed, the demand is there, and the reasons for it, and we can happy to support on drafting those talking points. And then appropriations is a great avenue to get that passed into law. So absolutely.
David, thanks so much for this. This was wonderful. The TVPRA, the reauthorization of TVP, we need to get that passed. It often happens in the lame duck session. So we've got 25 days. You have a robust program for reaching out to encourage people to take action. We have a robust program to encourage our members to take action. Is there some way within these 25 days that we have left that we can do some common messaging to people on the importance of getting this passed now? It would be very helpful if we could work together. In USCSAHT, we see ourselves as the public Catholic voice on anti-trafficking legislation. So we'd love to work with with you as CCB to push this over the finish line and use that as a model for continued legislative work together. But
Absolutely.
we'd be really interested in working together, especially on this, because it's the core piece of trafficking legislation in our country. So, and the budget for it is minuscule, you know.
At $1.1 billion,
Yeah, it's
would be great.
we'll take anything, you know, and grow from there. But I think it would be helpful. Also, again, I appreciated your framing of the issue as pro-life issue, because it absolutely is. And I think sometimes the understanding of people in our church look at pro-life as much more circumscribed. It's a very broad issue. So I think we can help with the framing of that. I think we can help bring our publics together on this. And I think we can help push it over the finish line if we can work together quickly, you know, within the next couple of weeks to get this done. We have a lot of people here who are interested in advocacy. Our membership keeps asking us to do more on advocacy. They're well acquainted with this legislation, so let's find a way to work together on this, okay?
Absolutely,
Love it.
100%
Thank you.
agree, of course. And I should say our executive director at MRS, Bill Canny, is very eager, as Katie knows. I think he sent her an email earlier this week or last week to collaborate with you all. And so we can 100% make that happen. Bishop Dorsonville, in the time he has left, will be more than happy, I know, to collaborate with you all on this. Bishop Seitz, no doubt. I can't, of course, speak on behalf of the bishops without at least consulting them first, but I know he will be, I'm very certain he will be interested in collaborating, so we can absolutely do that. Yes, of course.
But is it Schumer that we need to storm? I mean, is it?
Senator Schumer is responsible for actually bringing things to the floor. So I would say Senator Schumer is always a good person to go to. We can't forget his counterparts on the other side of the aisle. Senator McConnell does need to hear from people as well as the minority leader, potentially as the majority leader in the next Congress. So let's not forget, as Catholics, we must always strive toward bipartisanship where possible. I speak on behalf of the bishops, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm trying my best. And then I should also say on the House side, Speaker Pelosi has, of course, already done her part in getting it through the House, but appropriations still has to work its way through the process, the full process, both chambers. So Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader McCarthy, also of the great state of California, will need to hear from people. So both sides of the aisle, let's go. Any other questions?
All right, any other questions?
We're probably close to-
People are coming in,
Yeah,
but thank you so much.
that's my pleasure. Thank you.